Speaker, make it clear.
Order.
Well, I did not make the comment.
Well, it's not about taking away rights. It is about giving opportunity.
Good, ladies and gentlemen, good evening and welcome to Citizen Aid, where we wrap the week's current affairs with a panel of bloggers and opinion shapers. Joining me tonight, she is the candidate for Central Auckland and Labour Party spokesperson on social development and children, MP Jacinda Ardern, and she is from the New Zealand's largest feminist blog, The Hand Mirror, commentator and blogger Julie Fairey. Welcome to you both. Coming up tonight, Issue 1, are Peter Dunn's GCSB changes substantive or cosmetic? Issue 2, are SIFs doing enough for 17-year-olds, and are they doing a good job at protecting children? And issue 3 tonight, will the Labour leader staff reshuffle prove to be the catalyst to reversing slumping polls? Plus, we'll end the show on a final word, but let's kick things off tonight with issue 1. The deeply disturbing and very controversial GCSB bill looks set to pass now. Peter Dunn has given his vote for a range of changes that seem terribly shallow as safeguards and empty of any real value, when the entire community of legal experts, civil liberty experts and internet experts have universally condemned what is effectively the largest erosion of civil liberties since the 51 waterfront lockout. One would have hoped that the checks and balances required to prevent this being a state-sanctioned mass surveillance program would have been significant. Sadly, they are not. Jacinda, a rubber stamp warrant regime, statistics after the fact of how many New Zealanders have been spied on, a review in 2015, a poorly resourced review panel of 2, and no guarantees that all of this won't end up with the NSA. These changes are purely cosmetic, aren't they?
Yeah, I would absolutely agree. They're cosmetic changes for what are significant reforms around what the GCSB is able to do with New Zealand citizens, which just simply hasn't been the case before. Obviously, we've seen some cases of illegal spying, but now it basically allows that to be legal in future and for all New Zealanders on behalf of other agencies. Now, what we've said is we want a review of all of our intelligence agencies, then let's look at whether we need legislative change, not the other way around, and that's unfortunately what John Key is doing.
What do you believe, as a politician and as someone who is a representative of the people, where is the state's responsibility in terms of how much power they can have over their citizenship when under surveillance?
Yeah, I mean, this is an era we have to be so careful of. I mean, you've seen in the United States the broad sweeping powers and the way that they've been used. And we have here John Key saying, well, we're going to give those same broad sweeping powers, but we promise we won't use them in the same way. Where do the citizens of New Zealand get their sense of security about that? You know, because unfortunately, I don't feel these checks and balances are enough, and I'm meant to be one of the politicians who is in a powerful position. Secondly, we're making these decisions with very little information on the table, because the Prime Minister is able to say, well, for security reasons, I can't tell you why it's necessary to have these changes. That is cold comfort for me, and it should be for all New Zealanders.
What does Peter Dunn get out of this?
It's really hard for me to know, actually. Personally, as a politician, I wouldn't feel comfortable being the one vote that would enable these changes to occur with those small little concessions that he's gained. I think it's not enough.
Julie, economic well-being is now a priority for the GCSB. Is spying on every environmentalist who might protest mining or any union who might strike, is that a proper national security threat?
I wouldn't have thought so, no. I mean, people have a right to have their say about political matters, and sometimes they're going to do that in ways that are skirting a little bit on the edge of the law.
Sure.
But I don't see a problem with that in a civic society. In a democracy, that's what happens. I think one of the things I'm very confused about with this law change is I have never heard the case made of why the GCSB now has to have the ability to spy on New Zealanders. I mean, that's what the SIS is for. What are the SIS going to be doing? What will the GCSB add? Why couldn't the SIS just access the GCSB resources when they needed them, which appears to be what the problem is? And why are we making illegal spying okay? I just don't get it.
If Solid Energy make the case, look, these crazy bloody protesters, they're gonna climb up a ship, they're gonna stop the coal ship leaving. It's gonna cost us $3 million in lost whatever.
Yeah.
They're going to use that information as the justification to spy on every Greenpeace member in an area. Isn't that a vast overstep of what we would expect the state to be able to do here?
And especially when you put it together with the law changes that Simon Bridges pushed through about the changes in terms of
Criminalising Greenpeace, right?
Yeah, offshore protesting as well, which he then decided weren't draconian enough, that made them even worse. So we're actually starting to see a picture building up, along with the undermining of the Human Rights Commission as well, that is actually a serious threat to people's civil liberties.
Jacinda, I don't want to say mean things about the Labour Party.
But
You
you're
know
going
I
to.
don't. You know I don't. But there are times, sometimes, when Labour say something before an election and then do something else once in power. So I want this to be crystal clear. If Labour win the 2014 election, will you as the new government rescind these powers, or are you going to allow the GCSB to keep them?
Yeah, well,
where are we?
And I guess this is the problem, because what we're saying is nothing should happen until we do the review.
Yep.
And so what we'll face is coming in, coming in with a piece of law in place. So what we need then to figure out is, do we then immediately kick off the review and look to see what changes need to be made at that point? And that's what, essentially, we have to work through. But what we really want to focus on right now is stopping the law being put in place in the first place, because once you kick that snowball off, very hard to push it back up the hill.
So what protections could New Zealanders expect if they are surveilled between now and 2014 when you guys get in? I mean, would if you have an inquiry, would you be able to stop that kind of surveillance?
Yeah, well, and that's essentially what we would have to pick up. Then we would be reviewing a law that probably would have already been in place, and we'd want to start looking at in what circumstances has it been used? Are we actually able to even publicly share that? Because this idea of having a select committee review where GCSB have used these powers when already we have a Prime Minister saying, well, no, actually, we can't share that information. It's top secret.
Right.
Really, honestly, how transparent will this be?
But there will, if you guys win 2014, there will be an inquiry. You guys will make that a priority?
Well, we've already said this review should happen before the legislation comes in. One extra point I want to make, because I think this was something that Steve Abel, I heard him say over the weekend, and we need to remind ourselves that so many of the important social changes we've seen and international changes we've seen in New Zealand have come off the back of protest. New Zealand's anti-nuke policy, our ability to share our views on apartheid. Some of the things we pride ourselves on of New Zealanders have been born off the back of our right to protest and our right to put up movements that often involve the state. If anything like this, I think, puts a barrier up for people being able to express that view as New Zealanders, we're losing something much, much greater than our privacy.
If the state had these powers at the time of universal suffrage, would they have all been under surveillance?
Oh,
all of the women
probably.
who would have been arguing for change?
Probably, and it acts, let's be honest, it acts as a deterrent. It acts as a cloak of fear for people who are exercising a legitimate right.
Julie, the SIS and GCSB collectively cost us over $100 million per year. How do taxpayers know they aren't funding a system that abuses their privacy and hands it over to the US intelligence services?
And that's a huge worry for me about this whole situation. And people say, oh, well, if you haven't got anything to hide, you haven't got anything to fear. And it's like, well, who decides what's something to hide? You know, what will under one government be, perfectly acceptable social activity may become something that's considered, verboten under another. And if this legislation's in place, you've got no protection and no oversight for taxpayers. And I also wanted to point out that with the Kim.com staff, when John Key said he didn't know about it because he was overseas, Bill English was acting Prime Minister.
Right.
Now, I asked the Prime Minister's office, what handover do you do on issues of security when the Prime Minister comes back? None. So they had no process of handover on those kinds of issues. I mean, this stuff is just, that's basic good practice for anybody, is when someone comes back from overseas and you're swapping roles, of that significance.
Yes.
So if they're not getting the basics right, how can we trust them with more power?
And asking them to hide the GCSB's involvement in the case is a pretty significant sort of question to both of you on this. When the head of the GCSB makes a decision, how do we know that he's making it in the best interest of New Zealand, or he's protecting his old school friend? How do we know that?
And again, when they're saying, well, you'll have a select committee process which allows you to review what's going on. This is apparently the concession Peter Dunn has got. Well, I've been a part of select committee review processes. you're only as useful as the information you're being provided. Your
Right.
ability to scrutinise
Right.
a minister or an agency is constrained by the information that's provided to you. So we then end up with an ever shrinking amount of information and therefore scrutiny and therefore transparency. And that's something that I certainly worry about. Secondly, there's a little irony here that Peter Dunn himself has been subject to a situation where he felt some of his
That's
personal
right,
communication was
exactly,
being exposed,
exactly.
and he chose to use the power he had not to reveal that information. Seems to me that he's now allowing, via the law, that kind of information to be exposed.
I think the
readily.
word's called hypocrite.
It's an unparliamentary term
yeah,
that I'm allowed
understand, I
to use.
understand. Yeah, that's I don't have a problem with that. How do I know that the GCSB boss is making decisions for the benefits of New Zealand and not covering his old school friends?
Well, you don't and you won't. It's that simple. I have no faith. I have no faith in what they're doing now, given
Yep.
what we've been told about
Yep.
all the illegalities. And making the illegal stuff legal doesn't change that.
Final question to both of you. Kim.com says he has evidence showing Key was aware of him before he's publicly stated that date in January. If that's true and Kim.com can prove it, does John Key have to resign?
I'd like him to do it with a fireworks display, perhaps the date of which they met.
But does
And a
John
big
Key
heart.
have to
Yeah.
resign?
Oh,
Have to
look,
resign?
all of his credibility, I think, is now coming down to... But, you know, the thing that gets me, Von, we've seen at multiple points through this where John Cleese claims
Yep.
have been discredited.
Yep.
So if we then see information from Kim.com which reveals that the Prime Minister has lied
Yep.
and misled New Zealand,
Yep.
it wouldn't be the first time.
Yep.
Ultimately, we need New Zealanders to sit up and start saying, I'm not getting the full picture here. I feel misled by the Prime Minister. Something's got to change.
If he's caught out lying,
Yep.
he's got to go this time, doesn't he?
Well,
He states so much on it.
I've felt like that many times before. And I think in a lot of ways, Key's greatest is the greatest strength of the National at the moment in terms of their polling and everything.
Yeah.
You know, they've got this likeable Prime Minister who comes across as not a politician.
Yeah.
But it's going to be their greatest weakness. Just as with Helen, you know, when things turned against the perceptions of her as being
Yeah.
someone who had, you know, a high level of control and great level of articulation, and, you know, people became a bit anti-academic and all of that kind
Yeah.
of stuff. This stuff will turn on Key. But I don't know, I don't know why he keeps going, because he's obviously not enjoying it all that much anymore. And I think we will get a tipping point where he says, you know, this just isn't fun anymore. I've got 50 million in the bank. I don't need to do this.
Thank you, panel. Moving on with our second issue tonight. Is SIFS doing enough for 17-year-olds? A range of options are being asked to be considered to give 17-year-olds more support with an independent body established to represent their interests and children's interests. Julie, SIFS' position is that they start discussing transition programs with foster children at the age of 15. When I was 15, I was more focused on playing with my Lego, which perhaps suggests something about my development, but rather than sort of looking into the complexities of living independently. Isn't SIFS being penny-pinchingly ridiculous here?
I think we're seeing a number of issues where this is happening, where there's this sort of magical date where apparently you're independent. In the case of the SIFS care, it's 17, but for teenagers with special needs, often it's 20, and at that point they are cut loose from having any support. And it is penny pinching. It's not the caring community and society that we all want.
Yeah.
And it just leaves people incredibly vulnerable.
Jacinda, you were with me at the Big Sleep this year to raise funds for the homeless. You heard what they had to say about foster children effectively being pushed out onto the streets without support services. Are we doing enough for 17-year-olds?
No, and this is something we've had concerns about for some time. I mean, if you'd said to any parent, you know, is there any chance that you would ever say to a child at 17, well, that's it, you're on your own, we're not your parents anymore, and yet essentially for these foster kids, the state is their parent, and at 17 we're casting them out. And I've heard cases of, for instance, 17-year-olds who don't have any housing, who are sent to women's refuge because they fall into a gap of not being legally entitled to any ongoing support. So the first thing we need to do is bridge the gap, ensure that the state maintains responsibility to at least 18, because then they can then transition into other financial support mechanisms, housing, working income and so on. But I think we need to maintain an ongoing role. You know, I see too many SIFS kids who have been in state care in prison I see terrible suicide stats of kids who are being ex-SIFS kids. You know, these are the kids who need the most support, and yet we treat them, we give less support than we do any other child, and that's just wrong.
How has this happened for such a long period of time?
I think part of it's actually because of the way that the Act's structured, we treat a young person within the SIFS Act at 17 as being an adult because for the criminal justice purposes. That's when the state wants to treat them like an adult. So we've always argued it needs to be moved.
Julie, for student loan purposes, you're responsible for your student, to your parents until you're 20. Until you're 20. Why do we give foster children 3 years less than they would actually receive with an actual family? Aren't these the very children who deserve more support and wraparound?
And I was reading in the Herald this morning that the average age at which people leave the home is actually 23.
Right.
So
Italian style.
So you've got this
student loan style.
So
So 6 years.
6 years. We're talking about 6 years where if you have a family who you can live with, then you're likely to stay home until you're 23. And the other thing is we've had the undermining of wages for young people as well, you know, which obviously undermines their ability to participate in society, to live in their own housing, those kinds of things. There's a whole, there's a whole suite of things.
Just simply the future prison population here. If we're not looking after these 17-year-olds, isn't this just filling those private prisons?
Exactly, and I do some work with special education people, and I had a psychologist say to me she was really worried about this child who was 11, and he had jail stamped on his forehead already at 11, and if they didn't sort it by the time he was 13,
it was over.
It was, you know, and I mean, what's going on for those children in their lives, that jail is the most likely outcome, and we as a society have to take some responsibility for that.
That's a failure of us, isn't it, as a society?
It's a much wider issue as well. So we've got the age at which we suddenly cut these young people off, but we believe we fundamentally need to do a review around the kind of care that they're offered in the interim. You know, I see kids who have had 14 foster carers by the time that they're young adolescents. Now, if that doesn't say to a young person that it doesn't matter what they do because no one actually gives a stuff about them, then no wonder we end up with these kids on a certain trajectory. We need to give them stable care.
Has a risk-averse SIFS, always frightened of negative media scrutiny of their case management, led to a culture where social workers have been given limited discretion in favour of a gung-ho, over-the-top, remove the kids from the family style of social welfare? Is that what's going on?
Yeah, well, I don't want to put all the blame on SIFS, actually. I think we need to take it right back and say, well, why are they risk-averse? Because as political masters, if something goes wrong, that's the first place the blame goes. Now, I think what we need to start doing is, like in the UK, they did a review recently that found, their social workers were becoming process-driven, and that was to cover themselves. We need to give them the ability to use their professional discretion on behalf of children. Now, one of the ways to do that is, A, make sure they're well-resourced to do their job well. At the moment, they're triaged.
And trained.
Trained and supported. So whilst most of them, of course, have had their training and are registered, they're not getting the supervision they need when they first go on the job because there's not enough of them. Secondly, as political leaders, we need to stand up and say the first place blame is going to go is not down to the front line. We need to just actually take stock of what's going on in those cases and just do better next time.
Final question to both of you in this. Just Speak are pushing to include 17-year-olds within the youth court system to get them out of the district court system. Is it wrong to put 17-year-olds in adult courts, and do you support Just Speak on this?
I definitely support Just Speak on this. I think issues about criminal liability, you know, what's the outcome we actually want to get here is we don't want to, sending people to prison shouldn't be the outcome we're always seeking. And so as far as I'm concerned, alternative pathways for justice, you know, restorative justice, all of that kind of stuff, it's always got to be a good thing.
Youth court has many more tools open to them in terms of getting those people into courses or help. You're not going to get in the district court. Why aren't we doing this?
Well, we already tried to pass an amendment. It got voted down. But the other thing that the government's done is that when it comes to children in the family court who have care and protection issues going on in their family, but also might have some criminal activity, the government wanted to be able to escalate them to the youth court. What we said was, look, the youth court have powers. Give the same powers to the family court, but keep a child where they're meant to be. And it's all ultimately about using the most appropriate option to deal with that situation instead of just trying to constantly ramp up the criminalisation.
Exactly.
Thank you, panel. Moving on with issue 3 tonight. Another poll, another slump for Labour, with the government passing deeply unpopular policy, yet remaining more popular than X Factor. The question now is, why is Labour performing so badly in opposition? The never-ending leadership speculation doesn't help. So could the new changes in the Leader's office prove to be the catalyst for a better performance in the polls? Jacinda, Fran Mould was the press secretary who oversaw last year's blog wars where Labour's grassroots savaged the leadership. How does that media strategy failure suggest her appointment as David's chief of staff will be the circuit breaker for Shearer?
Do you know what I think? Obviously people are interested in what happens within the staff of the Leader's office. But ultimately, we all, as MPs, as political actors, as leaders, we need to take responsibility for ourselves, you know. And yeah, it matters whether or not we've got good staff around us. But ultimately, whether or not we succeed or fail, that's on our heads, on our shoulders. And I don't want to see that passed on to any staff member. They're there in a support role, helping us do our jobs, but ultimately it's up to us to do our job.
Julie, is Shearer being well advised? I mean, how much of Labour's problems are just political mismanagement?
I always hate it when you ask me about this stuff, Ardern.
Especially when I'm sitting here.
Yeah, it's always very tricky.
Because come on, let's just as one example. The going into the corporate box of Sky was a bad call.
He wasn't the only one though.
That's right,
And-
which makes it worse.
And I mean, and that's the thing is, I mean, it was a bad call for all of them. I mean, recently I went to a film in the film festival that happened to be at Sky City. I won free tickets, and my partner and I, because we've both spoken out against the convention centre deal, were kind of like,
I know,
we shouldn't
yeah,
go,
no,
but we did.
Yeah.
It was a really good film.
Yeah.
Omar, I strongly recommend it. And but we constantly think about that stuff at a local government level.
Yes.
And it really wasn't.
So
it wasn't
is it,
hard
so,
to
so
get that
is
right.
It, so is it political mismanagement? What's going on?
I don't know. I think there's a disconnect sometimes between, I see there's a bit of a generational shift in Labour as well. That you see a lot of the politicians who did go to the Sky City box were the, Phil Goff and they were Clayton Cosgrove. They were older MPs,
The old guard.
who have that, who have been part of that culture of when corporates give us donations. It is actually, it genuinely doesn't affect us.
Yep.
But the public perception has changed, particularly for Sky City. It's very sensitive.
I do think it's still useful to put some context around some of the debate that's generally happening with Labour. We have consistently, and I'll come back to the last poll from 3, but otherwise we've consistently polled in the 33 to 34% range. If there were an election tomorrow with the coalition partner options Labour has, we would look to have either a dead heat or a win. Now that seems to, when did we lose sight of the fact that actually we have got National in a bind. They don't have many support partners. That's why suddenly John Key's giving up his principal position on New Zealand
Winston's
First.
his new friend.
That's happened because he knows that National is in trouble.
That's right.
And yet for some reason we have a focus of a media who absolutely want to see Labour on its knees in spite of what the polls are saying that are the contrary. Now when we come to the last poll that we had with TV3, that had us I think at 31%. That poll went out into the field off the back of the debate around women's shortlists and etc. Interestingly, TV3 went into the field early. That was not the cycle that they were meant to have with their polling based on the last time they polled. They knew that there was going to be some negative feedback. We knew there would be negative feedback. We heard what the public said and we responded to it. Now you can't tell me that it's not slightly mischievous and misleading to go out into the field earlier than you intended, knowing that you would come back with a poor poll result.
Final question to both of you on this. Look, what does Labour do to get into the game again? Because a lot of us are sitting on the sidelines begging for an option that isn't John
And
Key.
knifing us from time to time.
Well, it's what we do. But what do Labour need to do? What are the issues?
I think I've said this before, the problem is not policy. Some of the policies are fantastic, in particular the way that with the NZ Power campaign they worked with the Greens. I think that kind of stuff that showed this is the heart of a future government. And let's be realistic about this. As lefties, Labour will be the heart of any government that kicks these guys out. And we have to actually work together more, I think. I think there is a role to be a critical friend. But sometimes I think some of us go a bit over the top with that, and it's certainly something I've been reflecting on myself.
It's not the policy, is it? The policy is good, it is smart, it's well thought out, it's the sizzle, it's not the sausage.
You look at all of the issues that people out there are crying out about. I mean, housing, Labor's going to build 100,000
Yep,
affordable houses. Power costs, NZ Power will bring down bills by 300 per annum. Jobs and job creation, we're focused on manufacturing. Whatever
so it's
the
not
issues
the
are.
message, it's the sizzle. What is going on?
There is absolutely no doubt that we need to keep talking about those issues, though. You know, you ask people in the street, they haven't quite still heard that we've got some of the answers to the things they're really worried about. Now, the thing that stops that getting through is no doubt the time that we waste talking about leadership issues.
Yeah.
Now, looking at things like a Helen Clark documentary, you're reminded she faced the exact same issue.
6 years.
And polled as a leader in opposition terribly.
Yep.
Now, this is what you deal with when you're in opposition. For us, it's about being solid, being confident, and continuing to talk to the stuff that matters.
Let's wrap the show there with final word. Julie, your final word to speakers.
I want to talk about something quite serious actually, which is rape. I had a discussion this morning with someone who is aware of, does some foster children issues, and she told me about a case with a young woman with special needs who had been raped by a respite carer. And the situation is that they can't prosecute the respite carer, or they won't, the police won't, because she's not considered a credible witness. Yeah. And I just wanted to, first of all, share that, but also to say, what is wrong with the way we operate as a society, where rather than focusing on it's not okay to rape, it's never okay to try and have sex with someone who doesn't want to have sex with you, and you don't own other people's bodies, and instead we focus on the behaviour of victims. And it's just something I feel really strongly about, and so I just wanted to have a little rant about it today.
Thank you for that. Jacinda, your final word.
I'd love to talk to you after about that. I had a similar case once. My final word is that I believe we need to start putting children at the heart of everything we do, whether it be young people who are in foster care or, for instance, grandparents raising grandchildren having their support cut by this government and their welfare reforms, or issues like child poverty. They are our future taxpayers. They are the ones who we are relying on in the future. We need to give them our absolute care and protection, and we're just not doing it right now.
Thank you, Jacinda. Thank you, Julie. Ladies and gentlemen, to my final word, if this GCSB bill passes, it will be a genuinely dark day in New Zealand's history. We have spilled blood on foreign shores to fight world wars to stop governments having this level of control over their citizens, and yet we've handed it over to a man who has appealed to our charmless, anti-intellectual little brother complex by slurring, "I'm comfortable with that," every time his government brutally and bluntly prunes away our civil liberties. When 7 sharp is the benchmark for public discourse, sleepy hobbits are the result. New Zealand just took a very long goose step towards a casual style of fascism, and all it took was some multi-millionaire trader peddling vacant aspiration for us to acquiesce. There are protests planned this Saturday at 2 p.m. around the country, so make sure you stand up and make your voice count. If you like tonight's show, please join our Citizen A Facebook site and connect with other like-minded news citizens, and follow me on my Citizen Bomber Twitter and Facebook page. Thanks for watching, whānau. Good night, Aotearoa.
Supporting local content so you can see more of New Zealand on air.